Chapter 8. Sounds in the Night. Next day the weather was good. At 9 o'clock Mr. Bentley phoned from London. "I've received your letter," he said. "You can stay for a few days. Send me any papers that look important. Leave the other papers in the house. Don't stay too long." "I'll finish the work as quickly as I can," I answered. "It's a strange old house," I added. "Mrs. Drablow was a strange old woman," Mr. Bentley said, and he put the phone down. By 9:30 I was ready. There was a basket on the front of the bicycle. I put everything in the basket. I cycled off happily. The little dog, Spider, ran along behind me. The tide was coming in. Very soon it would cover the causeway. But that did not worry me. The air was clear. The sun was shining on the water. Seabirds were flying and calling over the estuary. I was soon at Marsh House. I opened the windows. I lit fires in several rooms. Then I sat down at a big desk. The desk was in front of a window. I could see the sky, the marshes, and the water. I started work. The desk was full of papers. Most of them I threw away, but I kept a few to look at later. I opened a cupboard, and then another. Papers, more and more papers. I looked at everything carefully. I worked hard all the morning. At 2 o'clock I had some lunch. Then I called Spider, and we went outside. I walked down to the old graveyard. Spider ran up and down. She was happy too. I tried to read the words on the gravestones, but they were too old. Most of the words were difficult to read. The writing on one stone was a little clearer. Some letters were worn away, but I could read most of the words. 2 people were buried here. I wondered who they had been. I looked around me. It was a sad place, but I did not feel afraid. The air was colder now. I went back to the house, and Spider followed me. I was soon back at my desk again. I read paper after paper, but there was nothing important. I made myself a cup of tea. I went on working. When it was dark, I closed the curtains. I turned on every light in the house. I put more coal on the fire. I brought papers from other rooms. Papers! So many papers! Mrs. Drablow had thrown nothing away in 60 years. It was getting late, but I went on working. I'll be finished in a day and a half, I thought to myself. Then I'll return to London and my dear Stella. At last I was too tired to go on. I took a book to read in bed. Then, taking Spider with me, I went upstairs. I was going to sleep in a bedroom at the back of the house. I read for about half an hour, then I turned out the light. Spider was already asleep near the bed. Some time later I woke up. The moonlight was shining into the room. Why was I awake? What had happened? I sat up, and then I saw Spider. The little dog was standing at the door. She was staring at the door, listening. The little dog was terrified, and so was I. I listened too. Yes, I could hear something. The sound came from somewhere inside the house. Bump, bump, bump. What was it? Spider looked at me, growled, and listened again. I got slowly out of bed. My heart was beating fast. I opened the bedroom door. The passage outside was dark and empty. Spider ran down the passage. I heard her sniffing at every closed door. I heard the sound again. Bump, bump, bump. It came from a passage on the left. Very slowly, I began to walk towards the sound. I opened the doors one by one. Every room was dark and silent. There was a door at the end of the passage. Spider sniffed under this door. Her growling became louder. It was the door I had found locked on my first visit to the house. It was the only door I could not open. Yes, the sound came from behind this door. Bump, bump, bump. I had heard this sound long ago. I had heard it when I was a child. What was it? Spider howled. The frightened little dog pressed against my legs. We were both shaking with fear. And still the sound went on. Bump, bump, bump. I heard another sound. It came from behind me. It came from the front of the house. The bumping noise stopped. I turned away from the locked door. Slowly and carefully, I walked back to my bedroom. Everything was quiet. The second sound had come from inside the house. I was sure of that. I looked round the room. Perhaps the sound had come from outside. I looked out of the window. I saw nothing, no one. The marshes were silver and grey in the moonlight. Did I hear a cry? I listened again. No. I felt something warm against my leg. I bent down to stroke the little dog. She was quiet again. I listened. Everything was quiet. The house and the marshes were completely silent. After a time, I went back to the closed door. I turned the handle. The door did not open. I pushed my shoulder against the door. It did not move. There was no keyhole in the door. I could not see into the room. I went back to bed, but it was a long time before I fell asleep. Chapter 9. Behind the Door. The morning was cold and wet. The sky was covered with thick clouds. It was raining. I was very tired, but after breakfast I felt better. I went back to the locked door. I stood and listened, but I heard nothing. At 9 o'clock I rode back along the causeway on the bicycle. Spider ran beside me. There was a letter from Stella at the Gifford Arms Inn. Her loving words made me feel very happy. In 2 or 3 more days we would be together again. I walked round the town buying more food. Then I rode back along the causeway. I was back at Marsh House in time for lunch. The clouds were thicker now. The sea mist was coming in over the marshes. Inside the house it was already dark. I put on all the lights, but the house stayed dark and shadowy. My fears returned. I decided to go back to the town. I went outside. There was some mist around the house, but I was able to see the causeway. However, it was completely covered by water. I could not return to Crithin Gifford that day. So I whistled to Spider. She ran to me quickly. We both went back inside the house. I emptied papers from more cupboards. I started work again. I worked hard for several hours. I found a packet of letters tied together. They looked interesting. After supper, I sat down by the fire and opened the packet. There were some papers and some letters. The letters were all in the same handwriting. They were signed Janet, or J. I remembered the gravestone I had seen. It was in the graveyard at the back of Marsh House. One of the names on that gravestone had been Janet. Was this the same Janet? There were dates on the letters. The letters had been written 60 years ago. Each letter began with the words, "Dearest Alice." Alice was Mrs. Drablow's first name. All the letters were written to Mrs. Alice Drablow. I looked through them quickly. Janet was Mrs. Drablow's younger sister. I began to read the letters carefully. They were short and in simple language. They told a sad story. Janet was unmarried, but she was going to have a child. The child's father refused to marry Janet, and he left the country. Janet did not know what to do. Her family refused to help her. Then the child was born, a boy. For a few months there were no letters. Then Janet began writing again, and now her letters were full of anger. "The child is mine," Janet wrote. "I will never give him to strangers." But Janet was unmarried. She was poor, and she could not keep the child. At last she had to agree that Alice could take the boy. In her last letter, Janet wrote, "Love him, Alice. Love him as your own child. But remember, he is mine. Mine. He can never be yours. Forgive me. My heart is breaking." Poor Janet, I thought. What a sad story. I began to look at the other papers. The first one was from a solicitor's office. The paper was about a boy called Nathaniel. Nathaniel was the son of Janet Humphrey. Nathaniel had been adopted by Thomas and Alice Drablow of Marsh House. Alice Drablow was Janet Humphrey's married sister. Nathaniel had been given the name Drablow. So the child, Nathaniel Drablow, had lived here, I thought, away from the mother who loved him. I thought for a few moments about Janet Humphrey and her sad life. Then I picked up the next paper. At that moment, Spider growled. The little dog was standing at the door. Every hair on her body was stiff with fear. I sat there for a few moments, frozen with fright. Then I stood up. If this was a ghost, I must face it. I made myself walk to the door. I opened it. Spider rushed out of the room and up the stairs. I heard her run along the passage. She stopped. I knew she had stopped outside the locked door. I heard the sound again. Bump, bump, bump. I knew what I must do. I must open that door. There was an axe in the woodshed. I must get that axe. Taking my torch, I stepped outside the house. It was very dark, but I found the woodshed and the axe. As I was walking back, I heard the sound of the pony and trap. It came from the front of the house. Had Keckwick come back for me? No one was there. No one at all. I could still hear the pony and trap, but now the sound was coming from the marshes. I stood there, Spider beside me. I was terribly afraid. Again, I heard the sounds of the water and the mud. I heard the pony shriek. I heard the child's awful cry. And then silence. I was shaking now. My mouth was dry with fear. I had heard these sounds before. The pony and child were not alive. I knew this. A pony and trap and all the people in it had sunk beneath the water. Spider began to howl and howl. I put down the axe and the torch and picked up the little dog. I carried her into the house. She was afraid, and so was I. After a few moments, the dog jumped out of my arms. She ran upstairs towards the locked door. I hurried outside, picked up the axe and torch, and followed her. The sound was louder now. When I reached the door, I saw why. The door of the locked room was open, wide open. I thought I was going to die of fear. The dog ran inside the room. The bumping sound went on, and now I remembered. I knew what the sound was. When I was a child, my mother had a rocking chair. Sometimes I couldn't sleep. Then my mother held me in her arms. She sat in the chair and rocked me backwards and forwards. Bump, bump, bump. That was the sound made by the rocking chair on the floor. I was no longer afraid. The sound meant peace and rest. There was evil in that room. I knew that. But it had gone away. Perhaps it was my happy thoughts. They had driven the evil away from that place. Holding the torch in front of me, I walked into the room. I pressed the light switch. Nothing happened. But my torch was powerful. I shone the bright torch round the room. The room had been a child's bedroom. There was a small bed in one corner. A tall rocking chair stood in front of the fireplace. The chair was rocking gently. But there was no one there. The room was empty. No one had passed me in the passage. There was no other door. I shone my torch at the window. It was shut. There were 2 wooden bars across it. The chair stopped moving. There was complete silence. The little room was clean and tidy. There were sheets and pillows on the bed. I opened a chest and a cupboard. They were both full of clothes. Clothes for a boy of 6 or 7. The clothes were beautifully made, but they were old-fashioned clothes, clothes of 60 years ago. The room was full of children's toys. They were neat and tidy. There was no dust on them at all. I saw toy soldiers and a sailing ship. There were games, paints and books, all things that little boys love. They had been here for 60 years, but everything was neat, tidy, and clean. There was nothing frightening in this room, only a feeling of sadness, a feeling of something lost. I felt sad, very sad. I went slowly out of the room. Spider followed, and I closed the door. I felt too tired to do any more work. I had a hot drink and went upstairs. The door to the child's bedroom was still closed. Everything was quiet. I went into my bedroom and closed the door. Chapter 10. Terror on the Marshes. That night there was a very strong wind. It whistled and howled around the house. The windows shook. I slept, woke, and slept again. Then suddenly I was wide awake. I thought I heard a cry. The wind blew more loudly. Then I heard the cry again. It was the cry of a child, a cry for help, the cry of a child dying in the marshes. For how many years had the child cried out? "Rest in peace," I prayed. But that child could not. I could not sleep. I got up. I opened the bedroom door. Spider followed me into the passage. Suddenly, 2 things happened. Someone or something went past me. The wind howled louder than ever, and all the lights went out. I stood there in the darkness. I could not move. Who had gone by? Who was in the house with me? I had seen and heard nothing. But I was sure of one thing. Someone had gone along the passage to the child's bedroom. Someone dead for many years. A ghost. I had to have a light. I walked back carefully into my bedroom. I went slowly to the table near my bed. I found the torch and picked it up. But it slipped from my fingers. It fell and broke on the floor. Spider came close and touched my hand. As I held the little dog, the wind howled again. And once more, louder than the wind, I heard the child's cry. I could not sleep. I must have a light, I thought. I cannot stay here in the dark. Then I remembered. I had seen a candle in the child's bedroom. For a long time I did not move. There was something evil in the child's bedroom. But I had to go back to get that candle. I went down the passage slowly. I opened the door of the child's bedroom. Everything was quiet. I found the candle and picked it up. Now I was in the bedroom, I was not afraid. But I felt sad. I had a feeling of something lost, someone who had died. I had never had that feeling before. Why did I have it now? After a few minutes, I walked slowly out of the room. I closed the door. At once, the sadness left me. In my bedroom, I found some matches. I lit the candle. I opened my book and began to read. Some time later, I fell asleep. When I woke up again, the sky was light. It was morning. Spider was standing at the door. She wagged her tail and looked at me. The dog wanted to go out. I got up and dressed quickly. Spider ran to the front door. I opened the door. Spider ran out happily. The air was very cold. Then I heard a whistle, a high, clear sound. Spider heard it too. Before I could stop her, she was running. She was running away from the house onto the marshes. I called and called, but she did not hear me. I watched the little dog running on and on. But who had whistled? The marshes were completely empty. Then I saw the dog slow down and stop. I knew at once what had happened. The poor animal was caught in the mud. The mud was pulling the dog down, pulling her down deeper and deeper. I could not let the little dog die. Without thinking, I ran out across the marshes towards her. The cold wind blew in my face. I could not see clearly. My feet stuck in the mud. I pulled myself free. The tide was coming in quickly. I called out to the dog. Most of her body was now under mud and water. I could not get any nearer to her. I could do nothing. We will both die here in this terrible place, I thought. No, it could not happen. Very carefully, I lay down. I stretched forward, little by little. The dog sank deeper into the mud. Just in time, I got hold of the leather collar round the dog's neck. I pulled and pulled. At last, the dog was free from the mud. We lay there, side by side, wet and muddy. We were safe, thank God. The dog was alive, and so was I. How long we lay there, I do not know. At last I got up. I began to walk slowly back to the house. As I got nearer to the house, I looked up. I saw the window of the child's bedroom. Someone was standing there, looking out. It was the woman in black. She stared at me. The hate in her eyes was terrible. I began to shake. Somehow I reached the front door of the house. Then, to my horror, I heard the sound I feared most, the sound of a pony and trap. Chapter 11. I Leave Marsh House. The next thing I knew, I was lying on a couch in the sitting room. Mr. Daly was leaning over me. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't. I did not know what had happened to me. "The trap! The pony and trap!" I said. "Oh, that was me," Samuel Daly said with a smile. "I've come here in a pony and trap. It's safer than a car on that causeway." "What's the matter? What did you think?" I've heard another," I said. "Keckwick, perhaps?" "No, not Keckwick," I said. "But why did you come?" "I was worried about you," said Daly. "It's a good thing I came. People have drowned in those marshes, you know." "Yes, I was nearly pulled under. And the dog." Then I remembered. "Spider!" I cried. "Where's Spider? Did she—" "She's safe," Daly said. "She's here." At the sound of her name, the little dog jumped up and wagged her tail. "Now I'm taking you home with me," said Daly. "You can't stay here." For a few moments I said nothing. I remembered what had happened to me. I knew that the woman in black was a ghost. But why was she here? I knew there was evil here, and sadness too. Why? I wanted to know, and I had to finish my work too. "Thank you, Mr. Daly," I said after a few moments. "I want to leave Marsh House. But what about my work? I must look at all Mrs. Drabblow's papers. I don't think there's anything important, but they must be looked at." "I found some letters last night," I went on. "They looked interesting. I'll bring them with me." Very slowly I got up. I picked up the packet of letters from the desk. Then I went upstairs to get my things. My fear had gone. I was leaving Marsh House. If I came back, I would not come alone. I packed my bag and left the room. I decided to have one last look at the child's bedroom. The door was open, but I was sure I had closed it. I could hear Mr. Daly downstairs. I was safe. I walked slowly towards the open door. Then I stopped. Did I want to go in? She had been here. I had seen her. I pushed open the door. I could not believe my eyes. Everything in the room was broken and torn. The cupboards were all open. Toys, clothes, and books lay on the floor. They had been thrown there by some terrible power. Everything was destroyed. Everything except the rocking chair. It had been pushed into the center of the room. The chair was not moving now. Who or what had done this terrible thing? Feeling ill and shaking, I got into the trap beside Mr. Daly. He knew that something had happened, but he did not ask any questions. He put Spider on my knees. I held the dog tightly. Then we drove off away from the house across the Nine Lives Causeway. Everything was grey and quiet. There was no colour, no sound. I looked back at Marsh House. No one was watching us. The house stood there, grey and terrible. As we crossed the estuary, I turned my eyes away. I did not want to see that terrible place again. Chapter 12. The Death Certificates. The Dailies invited me to stay with them for a few days. I agreed, thankfully. After a few days, I would go straight back to London, not to Marsh House. I would never go back there again. But I was angry. I had not finished my work. The woman in black had stopped me. Then I remembered the papers I had brought with me from Marsh House. The letters told a sad story. I wanted to know how the story ended. I read the letters again. Poor Janet. She had loved her child so much, but she was unmarried. She could not keep her boy. She had to give him to her sister, Mrs. Drablow. The child had lived at Marsh House. What had happened to him? I picked up the other papers and looked at them. They were death certificates. The first was for a boy. Name, Nathaniel Drablow. Age, 6 years. Cause of death, drowning. I looked at the second certificate. Rosa Judd, nursemaid. Cause of death, drowning. On both certificates, the date of death was the same. I held the death certificates tightly in my hand. I felt myself grow cold. I got up and walked about the room. Then I looked at the last piece of paper. It was another death certificate. This time, the date was 12 years later. The certificate was for Janet Humphrey, unmarried, age 36 years, cause of death, heart failure. I sat down in my chair. One thing was clear. The woman in black was Janet Humphrey or her ghost. I did not believe in ghosts, but I had seen her. And now I knew something else. Long, long ago, a pony and trap had left the causeway. It had sunk down in the mud of the marshes. A child and a nursemaid had been drowned. Janet, the boy's mother, had died 12 years after her son. I knew where they were buried. They were buried in the old graveyard behind Marsh House. Nathaniel had slept in that bedroom. For 60 years the bedroom had stayed the same. Those clothes, those toys were his. Janet Humphrey was the woman in black. Her hatred had never left her. Her ghost followed anyone who went near Marsh House. What power did Janet Humphrey have? Could the dead harm the living? I did not know the answer. I wanted to find out the answer. Chapter 13. Nothing can happen now. That evening, after dinner, I had a long talk with Mr. Daly. Spider was asleep in front of the bright fire. Daly gave me a drink, and I began my story. I told him everything I had seen and heard. When I had finished, there was silence. My story was told. I was at peace. "Well, young man," Samuel Daly said at last, "you've had an unhappy time here." "Yes," I said, "but it's finished. Those things can't harm me now, can they?" Daly said nothing, but he looked unhappy. "Nothing can happen now," I said with a smile. "I'm never going back there. All is well." Daly said nothing. I began to feel worried. "Can there be anything else?" I asked. "Nothing will harm me now, will it?" "Not you, perhaps," Daly said slowly. "You can leave, but the rest of us must stay here. We have to live with it." "With what? Live with what?" I asked. "This town has lived in fear for a long time," Daly said. "For more than 50 years. Terrible things have happened, but people don't talk about them." My heart beat faster. I did not want to know any more, but Mr. Daly went on talking. "You know most of the story, but not all of it," he said. "Janet Humphrey sent her boy to Marsh House, to her sister, Mrs. Drablow. At first, Janet went away to another part of the country, but she had to be near her son. She came back to Crithyn. She got work in the town, but Alice Drablow refused to see her. She refused to let Janet see the child. Janet's anger was terrible. So Alice Drablow allowed her to visit the house, but she must never tell the boy who she was. But the boy looked like his mother, and he loved her. He loved his mother more than Alice Drablow. Janet wanted her son back. She planned to take him away from Marsh House. Then the accident happened. The sea mist came down suddenly. The boy and the nursemaid were drowned. The driver of the trap, too. He was Keckwick's father. And the boy's little dog. They were all drowned, Daly said. "All drowned," I said slowly. "Yes, and Janet saw everything. She saw everything from the bedroom window." "Oh, my God," I said quietly. "Janet Humphrey began to go mad," Samuel Daly said. "She was mad with sorrow and anger. She said her sister had killed her son. Then poor Janet became ill. She became thin and pale. Children were frightened of her. When she died, people began to see her ghost. There is something more terrible. Each time she is seen, something else happens." "What?" I asked. "A child has died, either by illness or in a terrible accident." "Any child? A child in the town?" "Any child," said Daly. "Once it was Jerome's child. You may find this hard to believe, Arthur," Daly added, "but it is true." I looked into his eyes. "I believe it, Mr. Daly," I said. "I believe it." That night I slept badly. I woke up again and again. I had terrible dreams. When morning came, I felt weak and ill. I was very ill for 5 days. In my illness, I had terrible dreams. In my dreams, the woman in black pushed her terrible face near mine. She sat on my bed, watching. I heard the cry of her dying child again and again. I heard the bump, bump of the rocking chair. Slowly, I got better. At the end of 12 days, I was well again. It was a day of winter sunshine. I was sitting downstairs by the open window. Spider lay at my feet. A bird was singing in the garden. I listened to it with peace in my heart. I heard the sound of a car and voices. I heard footsteps. The door behind me opened. "Arthur," a voice said quietly. It was a voice I knew. I turned quickly. My dear Stella was walking towards me. She had come to take me home. The next morning, Stella and I left together. We did not go back into the town. We went straight to the railway station in Mr. Daly's car. The Dalys had looked after me well. I was sad to say goodbye to them. They agreed to visit us in London. And I was sad to say goodbye to Spider. There was a question I had to ask Mr. Daly. I waited until Stella was saying goodbye to Mrs. Daly. "There is something I must know," I said to Mr. Daly. "You told me that a child always died." "Yes, always." "Then has a child?" "No, nothing has happened," Daly said. "A child hasn't died yet." "Then pray God the woman in black has gone forever," I said. "Pray God her power is at an end." Yes, Daly said. "We all hope that." I began to feel sorry for poor Janet Humphrey. She had lost her son. Her sorrow and anger had made her mad. Now Mrs. Drablow was dead. Marsh House was empty. Wasn't that the end? Could Janet Humphrey rest in peace now? The train was waiting. I said goodbye to the Dalys. Thank God, my business in Crithin Gifford was finished. Chapter 14. The Story Ends. That is nearly the end of my story. I have one last thing to write, but it is the most terrible thing of all. For days and nights I have sat at my desk here at Monk's Peace. I have tried to write down the rest of my story, but my tears have stopped me. My dear wife, Esme, sees I am unhappy, but she doesn't know why. But now I am ready to finish my story. Stella and I returned to London. 6 weeks later we were married. My wife and I were not rich, but we were happy. A year later, our son was born. Our happiness was complete. I did not think of the past, and I had no more bad dreams. Another year passed. Our son was about a year old. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon. Stella and I took our boy to one of the parks in London. Everyone was happy. The sun was shining. Children were running about on the green grass. Music was playing. Everyone was enjoying the holiday. Someone was giving rides to children in a pony and trap. Our son saw the trap. He shouted and pointed at it. It was a small trap. There was room for only 2 passengers. So Stella took the boy. I stood watching them happily. The trap went behind some trees. I looked around me at the happy people, and then I saw her, the woman in black. She was standing near a big tree. She looked at me. There was no mistake. I was looking at the white face and staring eyes of Janet Humphrey. My body was icy cold. I could not move. I saw the terrible hate in the woman's eyes. At that moment, the pony and trap came back. It came towards me, between the tall trees. My dear Stella was smiling. Our little son was laughing. I stepped forward. They passed the tree where the woman in black was standing. She moved quickly in front of the pony. The frightened pony shrieked. It turned and ran back under the trees. The driver could not stop it. There was a terrible crash. Then silence. The woman in black had gone. But my darling Stella and my dear son lay on the grass. They did not move. Our baby son was dead. Stella's body was broken, but she did not die, not then. For 10 long months I sat by her bed. Then Stella died at last from her terrible injuries. They asked me for my story. I have told it. There is nothing